Hello. Welcome back. You are doing great. We already completed 50% of the chapters. Now, as you know, in series we are covering PM Body of Knowledge 6th edition. Moving forward to Chapter 7, Project Cost Management.
Ever wondered why some projects, like building a new community hall or maybe even just organizing a big school trip, they sometimes end up costing way, way more than planned?
Oh, absolutely. Or why sometimes, even if you think you've planned carefully, the money just sort of vanishes.
Exactly. We've all been there, right? Whether it's your monthly pocket money disappearing too fast or maybe a family wedding budget just spiraling out of control. Managing money, it's a real challenge.
It really is.
So today we're taking a deep dive into something called project cost management. Now, it sounds a bit formal, I know, but trust me, it's really about making smooth decisions with money. Doesn't matter if you're building a skyscraper or, just planning your next Diwali celebration.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating, I think, is that the principles, the actual clever ideas they use for these huge multi-crore projects, they're basically the same ones you can apply in your own life day to day.
Really? The same ideas?
Essentially, yes. We're going to break down how these expert project managers plan and guess the costs, set the budget, and then control those costs to make sure projects finish, well, hopefully within the money they were given.
Okay.
Think of it like learning a superpower. The superpower to manage money for any goal you have, big or small.
A money management superpower. I like that. Okay, so we've got some really insightful material here today, and it outlines 4 key steps in managing project costs. We'll start with the big picture, then we'll zoom into each step. We'll explain how they work, the tools project managers use, and importantly, how you can apply these ideas.
Sounds good.
And to make it super clear, let's imagine we're planning a big project together today. Let's say we're setting up a fantastic new community sports ground right in your neighborhood.
Oh, nice idea. A practical example always helps.
Exactly. Ready to unlock some financial wisdom. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So first things first, the big picture. What exactly is project cost management?
Well, simply put, it's all about making sure a project like our community sports ground idea gets finished without spending more money than was set aside for it.
So no running out of cash halfway through?
Hopefully not. It covers everything. From the initial guesses about how much things will cost, putting that into a proper budget, actually getting the funds, managing the spending day to day, and crucially, making sure nobody goes over budget without a good reason and approval.
Right. It's like, imagine your family decides to paint the house. Project cost management would be like your parents figuring out how much paint is needed, how many painters, how many days it'll take, estimating all that.
And then making sure they actually stick to that plan and don't suddenly run out of money when only half the house is painted.
Exactly. So our sources break this down into 4 main processes, right? Like a roadmap.
That's right. 4 key steps, although they often overlap in practice. First, there's plan cost management. This is where you decide how you're going to manage all the money stuff, setting the rules of the game, basically. For our sports ground, this means deciding, who needs to approve spending, how often will we check the budget, how detailed do our records need to be.
Got it. Step 1, set the rules. What's next?
Second is estimate costs.
Yeah.
This is where you actually figure out or make your best guess of how much each part of the project is likely to cost.
The guesswork part.
Educated guesswork, hopefully. For the sports ground, this means estimating the cost of, say, the land preparation, the grass, the goalposts, maybe some basic fencing, lighting, all the individual bits.
Okay, makes sense. Then what?
Third, you determine budget. You take all those individual cost estimates you just made, add them up, and then get the official approval for the total amount you can spend on the entire project.
So this is where it becomes the official number, the final approved amount.
Exactly. For our sports ground, this is when maybe the local council or whoever is funding it officially says, okay, you have X lakh rupees for this project, go. That approved amount becomes your benchmark.
And the final step.
Finally, number 4, control costs. This isn't a one-time thing. It's ongoing. It's about keeping a close eye on the actual spending while the work is happening.
Watching the money.
Constantly. You track where the monies are going, compare it against your plan, and if things are going off track, you make changes to get back on budget. It's the active monitoring and adjusting part.
Okay, so plan, estimate, budget, control. But you said they overlap. It's not strictly step by step.
Not usually in real life, no. They interact a lot. You might be estimating costs for one part while already controlling costs for another part that's underway. Or you might need to revisit your plan based on what you find during estimating or controlling. It's more of a cycle.
Right, and this brings up something really interesting the source mentioned, the power of planning early. It says the ability to influence cost is greatest at the start. What does that really mean in practice?
It's hugely important. Think about it like planning a birthday party. If you decide right at the beginning, okay, small party at home, the cost is likely to be low. But if you start planning for that small home party, then halfway through someone says, oh, let's invite 50 more people and hire a big hall. Trying to change that plan later is going to be much, much more expensive and complicated than if you decided on the big hall from the start.
Okay. So making the big decisions early locks in a certain cost range.
Pretty much. For our community sports ground, if we decide early on we want professional standard floodlights and seating for 100 people, that sets a certain budget expectation. If we plan for a very basic ground initially and then try to add those big features later during construction.
It's going to cost a fortune compared to planning it from the get-go.
Exactly. The later you make significant changes, generally the more expensive they become. So defining clearly what you want the scope right at the start is critical for keeping costs under control later. If the scope is fuzzy, costs tend to creep up.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's not just about the cost to build it, right? The source talks about life cycle costs.
Yes, that's another really smart point. Project cost management isn't just about the cost to, say, build our sports ground. It's also about thinking ahead to how much it will cost to run it, to maintain it, over its entire life.
So the long-term costs.
Precisely. The source gives an example. Maybe you save money during the design phase of a product by doing fewer reviews. Lower project costs, great. But that might mean the product is less efficient or breaks down more often, leading to higher running costs for the customer later.
Right, like buying a really cheap unbranded scooter, it saves money up front, which is your project cost.
Lower initial investment.
But then it might need constant repairs, guzzle fuel, break down often. So your running costs or maintenance costs over the next few years end up being much higher than if you'd bought a slightly more expensive but reliable branded scooter initially.
That's a perfect analogy. You have to balance the upfront project cost with the total cost over the product's or facility's entire life. Sometimes spending a bit more initially saves a lot more down the road.
A very important point. The source also mentions that different people see costs differently and at different times. Why is that significant?
Well, think about our sports ground project. You have many people involved, right? The person actually buying the cement, the project manager overseeing everything, the accountant paying the bills, the community leader trying to raise funds.
Yeah, lots of different roles.
And each might measure or recognize a cost at a different point. The person ordering cement might think of the cost when they place the order. The accountant might only record it when the invoice is actually paid, maybe 30 days later. The fundraiser is focused on the total budget needed versus funds raised.
I see. So the cost exists, but when it gets counted or who is looking at it changes the perspective.
Exactly. The source asks, when is an item's cost actually measured? When you decide you need it, when you order it, when it physically arrives, or only when you pay for it. Understanding that different stakeholders might have different answers helps avoid confusion and ensures everyone's working with the same understanding of the project's financial status.
Good point. Now, the source mentions something called earned value management, EVM, and an emerging practice called earned schedule. That sounds a bit technical.
It can seem that way, but the core idea is pretty clever. Earned value management, or EVM, is a standard way project managers measure performance. It basically compares the work you plan to do against the work you actually did and what you actually spent.
Okay, so comparing plan versus actual work and cost.
Right. Now, earned schedule, or ES, is kind of an extension of that. It focuses specifically on the time aspect. It asks, based on the value of the work we've completed so far, how much time did we plan to spend to achieve this much work?
So it translates the work done back into a time equivalent from the original plan.
Exactly. Let's say our plan for the sports ground was to complete work worth 1 lakh by the end of month 2. If by the end of month 2 we've actually completed work worth 1.2 lakhs.
We've done more than planned.
Right. Earned schedule would say, how long did we plan it would take us to do 1.2 lakhs worth of work? Maybe the plan said that would take 2.5 months. So even though only 2 months have actually passed, that's the actual time, AT, our earned schedule, ES, is 2.5 months.
So ES minus AT, 2.5 minus 2 is positive 0.5 months. We're half a month ahead of schedule.
You got it. If ES is greater than AT, you're ahead. If it's less, you're behind. It gives a clearer picture of schedule performance than just comparing planned cost versus earned value cost.
That's actually a really neat way to think about schedule progress based on work achieved. Okay, so we've got these processes and concepts, but not every project is the same. Our sports ground is different from, say, developing a new software app. How do project managers tailor this whole cost management thing?
Tailoring is absolutely key. You wouldn't use the exact same detailed approach for a small, quick project as you would for building a massive bridge, right?
Definitely not.
So project managers consider several things, like knowledge management. Do we have good records and lessons learned from similar past projects? That helps tailor the approach. Are there existing company or community policies for estimating and budgeting? We need to follow those. Are we required to use specific tools like earned value management? That dictates some methods.
Okay.
And importantly, is the project environment stable or is it rapidly changing, like in agile projects?
Yeah.
And what are the governance rules? How strict are the approvals needed?
Right. You mentioned Agile there. How does cost management work for projects where things change all the time, like software development where user feedback might constantly shift priorities? Detailed cost planning seems almost impossible.
It's definitely different. The source points out that for these high uncertainty agile-type projects, trying to create a super detailed cost estimate for the entire project up front isn't very helpful. It would likely be wrong very quickly.
So what do they do instead? Just guess.
They use more lightweight methods. They might make very rough, high-level forecasts for the whole project just to get a general idea.
Yeah.
But for the actual work being done in the near term, say, the next 2 or 3 weeks, they might estimate costs more precisely for just that small chunk of work.
Ah, so detailed estimates for the immediate stuff, rough guesses for the distant future.
Sort of, yes. And often, if the overall budget is fixed and very strict, which it sometimes is, even in Agile, then the focus shifts. Instead of constantly re-estimating costs as features change, they adjust the scope, what features get built, or the schedule, how long it takes to fit within the fixed budget constraint.
So the budget becomes the anchor, and scope or time become the variables you adjust.
Exactly. It's a different way of managing the constraints when you accept that change is constant. Like planning a surprise party. You have a rough budget, maybe, but the exact details shift as you go, and you adjust the plan to stay within your spending limit, rather than trying to fix every single cost up front.
That makes sense. Okay, fantastic overview. Shall we dive into the first specific step then? Plan cost management.
Let's do it. Step 1, setting the rules.
So this first step, plan cost management. You said it's like deciding how you're going to manage the money before you start, like deciding the recipe and measuring tools before you start cooking.
That's a good way to put it. It's about establishing the policies, the procedures, the documentation, basically, the framework for how project costs will be estimated, how they'll be budgeted, how they'll be managed day-to-day, monitored, and controlled throughout the entire project lifecycle.
And the main benefit is just having that clarity, that guidance.
Exactly. It provides guidance and direction. It ensures everyone involved in our sports ground project knows how financial decisions will be made, how progress will be tracked, and who is responsible for what. It sets the stage for everything else.
Okay, so to create this plan, what kind of information do you need to start with? What are the inputs?
Well, first you usually need the project charter. That's the document that formally authorizes the project.
The official green light.
Right. And it often contains some preliminary information, maybe a summary budget or pre-approved financial resources, like your parents giving you the initial okay and maybe some starting pocket money for the month, along with some rules.
Got it. What else?
You need the overall project management plan, or at least parts of it that are ready. Specifically, things like the schedule management plan, knowing when work happens, impacts cost timing. And the risk management plan, identifying risks, helps you plan for potential cost impacts.
Okay, so the overall plan and the risks. What about things outside the project itself?
Yes, those enterprise environmental factors we touched on earlier are crucial inputs here. Things like the organizational culture. Is your community group very formal about money or more relaxed? Market conditions are huge. What's the current price of steel or labor for our sports ground? Currency exchange rates if we're importing anything? Publish commercial information like supplier price lists, and even productivity differences between regions if your project spans multiple locations.
So the external world affects how you plan to manage costs.
Absolutely. And then there are the internal factors, the organizational process assets. These are the resources and knowledge your group already has.
Things you've learned from before.
Exactly.
Right.
Like existing financial control procedures, how expenses get approved, how audits are done, historical information and lessons learned from past projects. Maybe the last community project had issues with tracking volunteer hours accurately, so you plan differently this time. You might have financial databases with past cost data or existing policies and templates for cost management and budgeting.
Okay, so you gather all that input. What tools or techniques do you use to actually create the cost management plan?
One of the most important is simply expert judgment.
Asking the experts again.
Always valuable. Getting advice from people who have experience with similar projects or expertise in finance, budgeting, or the specific type of work, like sports ground construction, is incredibly helpful in setting up a realistic and effective plan.
Makes sense. What else?
Data analysis comes in, particularly looking at alternatives analysis. This involves considering different ways to approach things from a cost perspective. For example, how will the sports ground project be funded? Through community donations, a government grant, a loan. Each has different implications for cost management. Or how will we acquire resources? Should we make certain things ourselves, like simple benches, or buy them? Should we rent heavy equipment like a roller, or maybe lease it if we need it for a long time? Analyzing these options helps shape the plan.
Like for a school play, should we make the costumes or rent them? Which is cheaper overall.
Perfect example. That's alternatives analysis. And finally, a very basic but essential technique, meetings.
Just talking about it.
Pretty much. The project team, key stakeholders, maybe finance people, they all meet to discuss and agree on how costs will be managed. They hash out the details, decide on the procedures, and finalize the plan together. It ensures buy-in and common understanding.
Okay, so after using these tools on those inputs, the main result is the cost management plan, right? The rule book.
That's the primary output, yes. It becomes a component of the overall project management plan.
And what kinds of rules are typically in this plan? It sounds like it needs to be quite specific.
It does. It needs to cover several key things. For instance, units of measure. How will we actually measure costs or resources? By staff hours, staff days, liters of paint, tons of steel, or just lump sums in rupees. Defining this upfront ensures consistency.
Okay, what else?
Level of precision. How detailed will your numbers be? Will you round costs to the nearest 100 rupees or track every single paisa? This depends on the project size and needs.
And level of accuracy. You mentioned that earlier. How close should the estimates be?
Right. This sets the target for how accurate your cost estimates should eventually become. You might specify a range, like our final estimates should be within plus or minus 10% of the actual costs. This often includes guidance on setting aside money for contingency reserves, those funds for expected but uncertain small issues.
Got it. What about linking costs to the actual work?
That's covered by organizational procedures links. This explains how the cost accounting will connect to the project's work breakdown structure, WBS, the breakdown of all the project tasks. Each piece of work gets a unique code, linking it to the accounting system so you can track costs for specific activities, like laying the foundation or installing the fence for our sports ground.
So you know exactly where the money is going.
Precisely. Then there are control thresholds. These are predefined limits for cost variations. For example, the plan might say, if any task goes more than 5% over its estimated cost, a formal review is required. These act as triggers for action.
Like warning flags.
Exactly. The plan also defines the rules of performance measurement, especially if you're using techniques like earned value management, EVM. It specifies how and when progress and cost performance will be measured. And finally, reporting formats. How often will cost reports be generated? What information will they contain? Who gets them? Weekly summaries for the team. Monthly graphs for the funders.
Wow, that's quite comprehensive. It really does set all the ground rules.
It needs to provide that clear guidance throughout the project. It might also include details on handling things like currency fluctuations if relevant, or how project costs will be formally recorded and approved.
Okay, so step 1, plan cost management, gives us the how. Now, step 2, estimate costs. This is where we figure out the how much, right? Making the actual guesses.
Exactly. Estimate costs is the process of developing an approximation and estimate of the monetary resources needed to complete each specific activity in the project. For our sports ground, this means guessing the cost for digging the field, buying the grass seed, paying the laborers, renting the roller, everything.
And you said earlier these guesses get better over time.
They absolutely should. Early in the project, when you have less information, your estimate might be a rough order of magnitude, ROM estimate. This could be quite broad, maybe negative 25% to plus 75% accurate. Very rough.
Wow, that's a big range.
It is, because there's still a lot unknown. But as the project progresses, you define the work more clearly, get quotes from suppliers, understand the risks better, Your estimates become much more refined, leading to what's called a definitive estimate later on, which might be much tighter, say, -5% to +10% accurate.
Much closer to the real cost.
Right. And you estimate costs for all resources involved. That includes labor, wages for workers, materials, bricks, cement, paint, equipment, rental or purchase costs, services, design fees, permits, facilities, renting storage space, plus allowances for inflation, any financing costs like loan interest, and those contingency reserves for minor risks.
Okay, so what information do you need to make these estimates? What are the inputs for this step?
Well, you definitely need the cross-management plan you just created in step 1, because that tells you how to estimate the rules, the precision needed, etc.
Right. The rule book guides the guessing.
Exactly. You also need the quality management plan, because the required quality level affects costs. Using higher grade materials for the sports ground, for instance, will cost more. And critically, you need this scope baseline. This is super important.
The scope baseline, what's in that?
It includes 3 key things. First, the project scope statement, which is a detailed description of the project and its deliverables, exactly what our sports ground will include. Second, the work breakdown structure, WBS, which breaks the entire project down into smaller, more manageable work packages or activities.
Like breaking down build sports ground into prepare land, install drainage, lay grass, build fence, etc.
Precisely. And third, the WBS dictionary. This provides even more detail about each of those work packages in the WBS, what tasks are involved, what resources are needed, quality requirements, acceptance criteria. You need this level of detail to estimate costs accurately for each piece.
Okay, scope is key. What other documents help?
Several project documents are useful. The lessons learned register from past projects can provide invaluable insights into how accurate previous estimates were or what unexpected costs arose. The project schedule tells you the duration of each activity, which directly impacts labor and equipment rental costs. Resource requirements specify the types and quantities of people, materials, and equipment needed for each task. And the risk register identifies potential risks that could impact costs, allowing you to factor in contingency or specific risk response costs.
So past lessons, the schedule, resources needed, and potential problems.
Got it. And those external factors again?
Yes, enterprise environmental factors like current market conditions, supplier pricing, material availability, published commercial information, catalogs, price lists, exchange rates, and inflation all influence your cost estimates.
And the internal stuff. Organizational process assets. Those are important too. Things like existing estimating policies or guidelines within your community group, templates for cost estimation, and historical data or project files from similar past efforts provide a strong foundation for your current estimates.
Okay, loads of inputs. Now, the techniques. We know about expert judgment. What else?
Right, expert judgment is still key. But we have other techniques too. Analogous estimating is one.
That was the comparison one, right? Comparing to a similar past project.
Exactly. This new sports ground seems pretty similar to the park we built last year, which cost X rupees. So let's start with that figure and adjust for inflation and any major differences. It's fast, relatively inexpensive, but generally less accurate, especially if the projects aren't truly comparable.
Okay. Then parametric estimating, the formula one.
Yes. This uses a statistical relationship between historical data and other variables. For instance, if historical data shows that building fences, like the one we need for the sports ground, typically costs Y rupees per meter, and we know our fence will be Z meters long.
You just multiply Y times Z to get the estimated fence cost.
Basically, yes. It relies on having reliable historical data and a quantifiable parameter, like cost per meter, cost per square foot, cost per installation. If the data and the relationship are solid, this can be quite accurate.
Okay. What about bottom-up estimating? Adding up the small pieces.
That's the one. You estimate the cost of every single individual activity or work package at the lowest level of the WBS. For our sports ground, you'd estimate the cost of digging the trenches for drainage, buying the pipes, laying the pipes, backfilling the trenches. Every single step.
Yeah.
Then you sum all those detailed estimates up to get the total.
That sounds like the most accurate, but also the most work.
It generally is the most accurate because you're looking at the details.
Yeah.
But yes, it takes significantly more time and effort, especially for large projects. It's like estimating the cost of a big wedding by adding up every single item. The venue, the food per plate, the decorations, the clothes, the photographer, the invitations, piece by piece.
Right. Now, 3-point estimating. The best, worst, and most likely guess one. How does that work again?
It's designed to deal with uncertainty in estimates. Instead of just one number, you develop 3 estimates for an activity. 1, optimistic, CO. The best case scenario cost. Everything goes perfectly, maybe you get discounts. 2. Most likely, CM. The realistic cost, based on typical conditions. 3. Pessimistic, CP. The worst-case scenario cost. Things go wrong, delays happen, prices increase.
Okay, 3 numbers. Then what?
Then use a formula to combine them into a single expected cost, CE. A common way is a weighted average that gives more weight to the most likely estimate. For example, optimistic plus 4, most likely plus pessimistic 6. You don't need to memorize the formula, but the idea is it gives you a more statistically sound estimate that accounts for potential variability and risk.
That's clever. It builds in the uncertainty. What about data analysis techniques here?
Several are used. We look at alternatives analysis, again, comparing different ways to achieve the same result, like using different construction methods for the sports ground pavilion and estimating the cost of each option. Then there's reserve analysis, specifically for calculating those contingency reserves.
The money for the known unknowns, the small risks.
Exactly. You analyze the risks identified in your risk register that could impact costs, and you set aside specific amounts within your estimate to cover those potential issues. This buffer money becomes part of your overall cost estimate and later, your cost baseline.
And cost of quality, spending more now to save later.
Yes. This involves estimating the costs associated with ensuring good quality, like inspections, training, better materials, versus the costs of poor quality, like rework, repairs, warranty claims. For our sports ground, maybe estimating the cost of using certified electricians versus someone less qualified. The initial cost might be higher, but the cost of fixing faulty wiring later could be enormous. It helps justify spending on prevention.
Makes sense. Any other tools?
Project Management Information Systems, PMIS. Basically, software tools like spreadsheets or specialized project software can help organize the estimates and perform calculations. And decision-making techniques like team discussions or even voting on estimate ranges can help achieve consensus and commitment from the team involved in the work.
Right, get everyone on board with the numbers. Okay, so after all that estimating work, what are the main outputs?
The key outputs are, naturally, the cost estimates themselves. These are the quantified assessments of the likely costs for each activity, usually expressed in rupees or whichever currency you're using. They might be presented at the activity level and summarized for higher levels of the WBS.
The numbers. But you also mentioned something else was really important.
Yes, the basis of estimates. This is crucial supporting documentation. It explains how you arrived at those cost estimates. It should include details like what data was used, example, historical data. What assumptions were made, example, material prices. What constraints were considered, even limited work hours. The range of possible estimates, example, 1,000, even potentially at 10%. The confidence level in the estimate and any identified risks included in the contingency reserve.
So it's the story behind the numbers, why you believe they're right.
Exactly. It provides context and helps stakeholders understand the estimate's reliability. And finally, you'll have project documents updates. As you estimate costs, you might uncover new assumptions, risks, or lessons learned. So documents like the assumption log, risk register, and lessons learned register get updated.
Okay, step 2 done. We have our estimates and the reasoning behind them. Now, step 3, determine budget. This is where we get the official stamp of approval for the total money.
That's right. Determine budget is the process of aggregating all those individual cost estimates for the various activities or work packages and establishing an authorized cost baseline.
The cost baseline. That's the key term here.
It is. Think of it as the official approved version of the project budget, broken down over time. It shows how much money is planned to be spent during each phase or time period of the project. This baseline becomes the benchmark against which you'll measure actual performance later on.
So it's not just a total number, but a spending plan over time.
Correct. It's time-phased. And importantly, the cost baseline includes those contingency reserves we calculated during, estimating the money for the known, unknown risks.
Okay, contingency is in the baseline, but you mentioned something else earlier that isn't management reserves.
Exactly. Management reserves are different. They are an amount of the overall project budget withheld for management control purposes. They are reserved for unforeseen work that is still within the scope of the project. These are for the unknown unknowns, the risks you can possibly identify or plan for during risk management.
Like that earthquake example for the sports ground, something totally unexpected.
Precisely. Management reserves are like the project's emergency fund, controlled by senior management or the funding body, not the project manager directly. They are not included in the cost baseline.
So the cost baseline is the budget the project manager manages day to day, including contingency for expected bumps. Management reserve is extra, held separately for major surprises.
You've got it. If a major surprise happens and management approves using those reserves, Then and only then is the cost baseline formally changed to include that additional funding. The total project budget is the cost baseline plus the management reserve.
Okay, that distinction is clear. What about project funding requirements?
This output specifies the total funding needed for the project, including management reserves, and when those funds are required. Often, funding isn't given as one lump sum at the start. It might come in installments. The funding requirements show these planned cash inflows, often represented as steps on a graph, against the planned spending curve, the cost baseline.
So you know when the money is supposed to arrive. What information do you need to determine this budget? Inputs again.
Many are similar to estimating. You need the project management plan, especially the cost management plan, resource management plan, which might have info on labor rates or material costs, and importantly, the scope baseline, WBS dictionary scope statement, because the budget must cover all the approved work.
Makes sense. Budget has to match the scope.
Absolutely. You also need the project documents created earlier. The basis of estimates, explaining the estimates, the cost estimates themselves, the project schedule, to time phase the budget, and the risk register, to ensure contingency and understand potential needs for management reserve.
Any other documents?
The business documents can be relevant inputs too. The business case that justified the project often contains financial analysis, and the benefits management plan might outline expected financial returns, which can influence budget decisions. Any agreements or contracts with suppliers are direct inputs, as their costs need to be budgeted for.
And the external and internal factors.
Yes, enterprise environmental factors like exchange rates still matter if applicable, and organizational process assets are key. Existing budgeting policies, procedures, reporting methods, historical information, and any specific budgeting tools or templates used by the organization.
Okay, inputs gathered. What techniques are used to actually aggregate those estimates and set the baseline?
Expert judgment is still valuable, particularly for understanding funding reconciliation or financing options. The core technique is cost aggregation.
Just adding things up.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
You sum the cost estimates of the individual work packages or activities upwards through the WBS hierarchy. So costs for tasks roll up into work package costs, which roll up into major deliverable costs, eventually reaching a total cost for the entire sports ground project.
Simple enough.
Then there's data analysis, specifically reserve analysis again, but this time focused on determining the management reserves. Based on the overall project uncertainty, historical data, and expert judgment, an appropriate amount is set aside for those unknown unknowns.
Calculating the big emergency fund.
Right. Historical information review can also play a role here, comparing the overall proposed budget against costs of similar past projects to check for reasonableness. Funding limit reconciliation is a very practical technique.
Making sure the spending plan matches the money arrival plan.
Exactly. You might have a great cost baseline plan, but if the funding only arrives in quarterly chunks, you might need to adjust the timing of certain activities in your schedule to ensure you don't plan to spend money before you actually receive it. This might mean shifting work around.
So the reality of cash flow impacts the plan.
It often does. Finally, for very large projects, financing itself can be a technique. This involves acquiring the actual funds, potentially through loans, bonds, or other financial instruments, often involving negotiations and specific terms that need to be managed.
Okay, so the big outputs from this step. We know the cost baseline is one.
That's the primary one. The approved time-phased budget against which performance will be measured. As you said, often visualized as an S-curve, showing cumulative spending over time starts slow, accelerates, then levels off.
And the project funding requirements.
Yes, that details the total funds needed, baseline plus management reserves, and the periodic requirements when you need the cash installments. It often shows the difference between planned spending and available funds, highlighting potential shortfalls that need managing.
Got it. And updates again.
Always. Project documents updates. The process of finalizing the budget might lead to updates in your cost estimates, the project schedule, due to funding limits perhaps, or the risk register.
Okay, step 3 complete. We have our official time-phased budget, the cost baseline. Now for the ongoing part. Step 4, control costs.
Right, keeping your eye on the ball.
So control costs is about continuously monitoring the project spending, comparing it to the plan, and managing any changes to that cost baseline, like checking your pocket money balance regularly against your spending plan.
Perfect analogy. It's a process of monitoring the status of the project to update the project costs and managing changes to the cost baseline. You're actively working to keep the project within the approved budget.
And the main benefit is just maintaining that baseline. keeping things on track financially.
Yes, ensuring the cost baseline is maintained throughout the project. But it's also about understanding why costs might be deviating, influencing the factors that create changes, managing the actual changes when they occur, and preventing unapproved changes.
So it's proactive, not just reactive tracking.
Ideally, yes. It involves monitoring cost performance to detect variances from the plan, ensuring that all change requests are acted on promptly, making sure stakeholders are aware of authorized changes and their impact, and crucially, preventing incorrect, inappropriate, or unapproved changes from being included in the cost reporting or baseline. It's also about trying to bring expected cost overruns back within acceptable limits.
Okay, so what information do you need to effectively control costs, inputs for this stage?
You absolutely need the project management plan, especially the cost management plan, which tells you how to control costs, and the cost baseline, your target. The performance measurement baseline is often mentioned too, which typically integrates scope, schedule, and cost baselines for performance measurement, like EVM.
So the plan and the target. What else?
Key project documents like the Lessons Learned Register can provide tips from the past on controlling costs effectively. You also need the project funding requirements to understand the planned cash flow. And the most critical input here is work performance data.
The raw facts from the ground.
Exactly. This is the actual data on how the project is progressing, what activities have started and finished, what costs have actually been incurred, Avicii invoices paid, labor hours logged, materials used, what deliverables are completed. Without this real-world data, you can't compare against the plan.
Makes sense. You need actuals to compare to the baseline. And organizational assets.
Yes. Organizational process assets like existing cost control policies, procedures, monitoring and reporting methods, and any specialized cost control tools your organization uses are inputs that guide how you perform this process.
All right, inputs ready. Now for the powerful tools and techniques for actually controlling costs. This is where that earned value stuff comes in strongly, right?
It certainly does. Expert judgment is still used, of course, for interpreting the data, diagnosing problems, and recommending corrective actions. But data analysis is really the powerhouse here, and earned value analysis, EVA, or earned value management, EVM, is a central technique.
Okay, break down EVA/EVM again simply. What are the key ingredients?
It boils down to comparing three key values at any given point in time for a sports ground project. 1, planned value, PV. This is the authorized budget assigned to the work that was scheduled to be completed by that point in time. It's your baseline plan. By the end of month 3, we plan to have completed work worth 1.5 lakhs. So PV at month 3 is 1.5 lakhs.
What you plan to spend for the work you plan to do?
2, earned value. EV. This is the value of the work actually completed by that point in time, measured in terms of the budget originally authorized for that work. By the end of month 3, we actually completed the work that was originally budgeted at 1.2 lakhs. So EV is 1.2 lakhs. It's the budget for the work done.
What the work you actually did is worth based on the original budget. Got it.
3, actual cost. AC. This is simply the total cost actually incurred and recorded in accomplishing the work performed by that point in time. To do that 1.2 lakhs worth of work, we actually spent 1.4 lakhs. So AC is 1.4 lakhs.
How much you actually spent for the work you did. Okay, PV, EV, AC. Now
you compare them. This is variance analysis. First, cost variance, CV. Formula is CV equals EV AC. It tells you if you're over or under budget for the work done.
So in our example, EV 1.2L minus AC 1.4L equals negative 0.2 lakhs or negative 20,000.
Exactly. The negative CV means you're over budget, cost over rent.
Yeah.
You spent more than the value of the work you completed. A positive CV would mean you're under budget.
Okay, CV checks the budget performance. What about schedule?
That's schedule variance.
Yeah. SV.
Formula is SVV equals EVPV. It tells you if you're ahead or behind schedule in terms of the value of work completed.
In our example, EV 1.2L minus PV 1.5L equals negative 0.3 lakhs or minus 30,000.
Right. A negative SV means you've completed less work than planned. For that time period, you're behind schedule. A positive SV would mean you're ahead.
Okay, CV and SV give you the raw difference in rupees. What about efficiency?
That's where the indices come in, Cost Performance Index, CPI. Formula CPI is EVAC. It measures cost efficiency, how much value are you getting for every rupee spent.
Example, EV 1.2L divided by AC 1.4L equals about 0.86.
Right. A CPI less than 1.0 means you're over budget for the work done, getting only 86 paisa worth of work for every rupee spent. A CPI greater than 1.0 means you're under budget, cost efficient. CPI equal 1.0 means you're exactly on budget.
Okay, CPI is cost efficiency. Schedule efficiency.
Schedule Performance Index,
Yeah.
SPI. Formula is SPI equals EVPV. It measures schedule efficiency. How fast are you progressing compared to the plan?
An example, EV, 1.2L divided by KV, 1.5L equals 0.8.
Correct. An SPI less than 1.0 means you're progressing slower than planned. You've only accomplished 80% of the work you planned to by this time. SPI greater than 1.0 means you're ahead. SPI equals 1.0 means you're right on schedule.
Wow, okay. Those four, CV, SV, CPI, SPI, give you a really clear snapshot of performance.
They really do. And then you use trend analysis, looking at these values over time, often plotted on graphs to see if performance is getting better or worse. Are the variances growing? Is the CPI dropping consistently? This helps identify problems early.
And forecasting, predicting the future cost.
Yes. Based on current performance, you can forecast the final project cost. The most common forecast is the estimate at completion, EAC. There are several formulas depending on your assumptions about future performance. For example, a simple one assumes future work will continue at the same cost efficiency, CPI, as you've had so far.
So EAC, original budget, current CPI.
That's one common formula, yes.
Yeah.
AAC equals BAC CPI. Or you might calculate it as actual cost to date plus a new estimate for all the remaining work. Forecasting gives you a realistic prediction of the final cost based on actual performance.
Okay. And you're still doing reserve analysis here too.
Absolutely. You monitor the use of contingency reserves. Are they being used up faster than expected? Are there remaining risks that might still need them? Do you need to request use of the management reserves for a major unforeseen issue? It's ongoing monitoring.
Now there's one more index, TCPI. That sounded important if you're in trouble.
The Two Complete Performance Index, TCPI. This is crucial when you're projecting an overrun. It calculates the Cost Performance Index, CPI, that you must achieve on the remaining work to meet a specific financial goal, usually either the original budget at completion, BAC, or your current forecast, BAC.
So it tells you how much more efficient you need to be from now on.
Exactly. It answers the question, how efficiently must we use our remaining resources to finish on budget? Or on our new forecast. If the TCPI is, say, 1.2, it means you need to get 1.20 worth of value for every 1.00 you spend on the rest of the project.
And if that number is really high, like 1.5 or 2.0.
It might indicate that the original budget is basically unachievable without significant changes. It's a reality check.
A very useful reality check, and software helps with all this.
Yes, Project Management Information Systems, PMIS, are often used to track PV, EV, AC, calculate the variances and indices, display trends, and help generate forecasts and TCPI calculations. It automates a lot of the number crunching.
Okay, controlling costs is intense. What are the main outputs from all this monitoring and analysis?
A key output is work performance information. This is the analyzed data, the calculated CV, SV, CPI, SPI, TCPI values, and trend analysis results. It's the summary of how the project is performing against the cost baseline, communicated in reports or dashboards.
The performance summary and the forecasts.
Yes, cost forecasts, particularly the updated EAC, are a major output. These are communicated to stakeholders so everyone understands the projected final cost based on current performance.
And if the news is bad or changes are needed.
That leads to change requests. If analysis shows a significant deviation or if corrective actions require changes to the budget, schedule, or scope, a formal change request is generated. This goes through the project's change control process for approval or rejection.
Okay, got to follow the process.
Absolutely. If changes are approved, they result in project management plan updates. The cost management plan might be updated. The cost baseline itself might be revised if the budget's formally changed, or the performance measurement baseline updated.
And finally, document updates.
Yes, project documents updates. The assumption log, basis of estimates, cost estimates themselves, lessons learned register, documenting what cost variances and how they were handled, and the risk register might all be updated based on the cost control activities and outcomes.
Wow, that covers a lot of ground. So recapping the whole journey for our community sports ground. Step 1, plan cost management, setting the rules for how we'll handle money. Step 2, estimate costs, making smart guesses about how much each part will cost. Step 3, determine budget, adding it all up and getting the official time-phased cost baseline approved. And step 4, control costs, constantly monitoring spending, comparing to the baseline using tools like EVM and making adjustments. It really is like a financial GPS for the project.
It is, and what I hope comes across is that this isn't just about being stingy or cutting corners. It's a systematic, thoughtful process. It's about making informed decisions based on data, anticipating challenges, and continuously steering the project to deliver the intended value efficiently. It forces you to think critically about every rupee being spent and whether it's contributing effectively to the goal.
And like you said at the start, even though we used the sports ground example and terms like earned value, the basic ideas apply everywhere. Planning your pocket money, estimating how much that new video game really costs with add-ons, setting a budget for school supplies, and then actually checking if you're sticking to it.
You're doing project cost management. Maybe not with fancy software, but the core thinking is the same. Plan, estimate, budget, control.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener.
Yeah, think about this. We live in a world where money often seems to just evaporate, right? Faster than you earn it sometimes. So how might actively applying just one of these principles we discussed, maybe thinking about a small contingency reserve for your next school project budget, or using that 3-point estimate, best, worst, most likely guess, before you make your next big purchase, how might that change things?
Could it just save you money? Or maybe even reduce stress because you feel more in control? Could it boost your confidence in actually achieving your goals, knowing you've thought through the financial side?
It's something to ponder. Because mastering these ideas isn't just about managing big projects. It's about mastering a fundamental life skill.
Absolutely. We really hope this deep dive has given you some powerful new tools, or at least some new ways to think about managing money for your own financial toolkit. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Join us next time for another deep dive into a topic you'll want to be well informed about.